Hey there. Hey, this week's video is a watercolor demo. Not so much a tutorial, but more of a workflow just to see the various phases and stages that I take a piece through. I work in 3 stages: the color blocking stage, the contrast and saturation stage, and the detail and structure stage. So color blocking, this is where I'll come in and establish all the tones and the hues in the piece, in the foreground, the middle ground, and the background on the objects. I'm just essentially doing a fast color blocking of all the components in the composition. Working from top to bottom. I vary the saturation so it's more saturated at the top. I'll add the color to the objects, to the subject matter, and then I work my way down the page, varying my saturation. It goes thicker in spots, thinned out in others. I pull it on down to the bottom of the page. And as my piece is very wet at this point, I'll start adding in secondary colors, bouncing around, pulling those colors around. It's still very wet at this point. You can see the sheen on the right side of the paper. And since it's wet, all of those colors are very fluid and they mix together with nice soft transitions. And at this point, the color blocking is done. We just have to let it dry. Once it's dry, we can move into stage 2. Stage 2 is contrast and saturation. And we're going to be reworking, bouncing around throughout the whole piece, adding in more color complexities, identifying shapes, little sharper edges on this since the paper is dry. I'm adding more color to the subject matter, developing a little more complex form, 3D modeling, a little more color complexity on the form. Adding in still fairly warm colors. Haven't really worked with much contrasting colors on the forms yet. Mostly sepia. Adding in that dark swash of color at the bottom for the shadows underneath the table. Touching it with some ultramarine and sepia. Getting that dark greenish brown. And now adding the saturation, a little more color contrast in on the objects themselves, the eggs. I'll bounce around and block them in with a lot of color, protecting highlights, and I'll soften those up with a dab of water. So I'll continue throughout the whole piece, just bouncing around, finding the shapes, intensifying, adding the saturation and the contrast, finding edges, softening edges, adding more color onto the forms to work to develop more three-dimensional form on the objects. So now I'm going to come in and work a little bit more on the thermos, adding a little more contrast, denser colors, shadow colors, bluish cooler colors, but still has that warm undertone to it. So laying in color, softening edges with water, feathering it out, creating that transition of form across the surface of the thermos. Now I'm going to introduce some cooler colors onto the bowl on the shadow side and bounce some of those cool colors around. Add the colors in, soften it up with water, feather it out, make a transition. It'll happen on the bowl. I'll add some to the thermos. And even add some of that warm color from the egg reflected onto the side of the bowl. So I continue to work around the piece, bouncing around, developing the value range. I'm adding in some really dark contrasting colors into the background to have the foreground objects pop away, softening the edge with water. That was a wet on dry application of that dark green, and then just simply softening that green application out with just pure water, creating a feathered edge. And we're going to wrap up this stage, let it dry. I'm going to bounce around a little more, but it'll dry. And we move on to our next stage, stage 3, which is structure and detail. All right, so I'm coming back in after the paper's dried, checking, make sure I don't set my hand in any wet spots. Make sure the paper's dry. And now I'm coming in with more saturated color, redefining edges, popping a little more saturated color onto the subject matter, softening up edges, coming in, creating sharp edges like along the rim of the bowl. Coming back with clear water, softening the back edge. Still working to create form and modeling on the eggs. Protecting highlights. Might pick and remove pigment. Reactivate the paper. Lift color off the page. And this stage can be a long process depending upon how much detail you're intending to work into the piece. Still working with saturating the egg, sharpening the edges, the outer edges, softening the inner edges of the strokes. Trying to get that highlight on the surface of the egg, that modeling. And now I'm prepping to start work on some of the detail on the thermos, the bowl, blocking in shadows, adding edges, intensifying the colors in the background. And I'll just bounce through a whole piece, adding that contrast, structure, detail, until it starts coming up and functioning as a whole. You can see I'm working with a much finer, smaller tipped round brush because I am working more with edges and lines, adding that detail, that structure, that contrast between the objects, the colors of the objects and the colors of the background. So I work with a much smaller brush. And this is where the mark making, the drawing skills, getting a different quality of line depending upon where it's going to be placed comes into play. You really have to have a good vocabulary of line quality and aesthetics towards line at this stage. This is where the piece really starts coming together. Right now I'm adding a little more contrast around, getting those edges, getting the subject matter to pop from the background. Again, really just drawing big thick lines, thin lines, broken lines. You really see the eggs are starting to saturate. Get some nice color on them, getting some modeling. Had 3 or 4 different layers of glazing. So I've been bouncing around, adding that structure, drawing with my brush, fairly thick mixture of pigment. And right now I'm adding in textural marks on the surface, getting the tabletop to read as wood. And I'm just bouncing around. Just keep bouncing, finding where structure needs to happen. I may be working with the tip of the brush, or I might be laying my brush flatter, getting more of a textural mark, a dry brush effect, which serves well for that kind of wood grain texture. I'm not cutting out a lot of the detail work and the structure work because you can kind of see how the piece really starts to come alive with all the edge work, the textures, the contrast. And this is the pickiest part of the painting, but it's important. It's where it really comes to life. All those little marks, those specks, those edges, they all work together to bring the piece into its final form and final state. So at this point, I'm starting to come back in to the background, adding a little more saturation to the background to give it a little better edge along where the thermos sits. So I'm glazing in more color, softening up the outer edges of it. And the final touches before I declare this piece completed. I'm bouncing in and popping in highlights on the egg, on the rim of the bowl, on the thermos, along the little wire handle, just to give it the additional highlight edges that I may have lost when I was glazing, and blocking in the colors. All right, I'm just fussing around with the piece, adding in some highlights, final highlights, just touching up, trying to make the decision of when this is complete. This has been my first long format watercolor tutorial that I'm posting. So if you stuck with me this long, I truly do appreciate it. If you found this video helpful, give me a like, a subscribe. Any support is much appreciated. Hey, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.